This is Arizona Politics and Culture, and Seth Leibson, Tom Brown. You can get Seth's monologue by sending us an email, apcpatriot@gmail.com. That's apcpatriot@gmail.com.
Thanks, Tom. We are privileged to be rejoined by Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. He is the author of a very important book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim patriot's fight to save his faith. He is the president and founder of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, and he is a member of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Dr. Jasser, welcome back. Thanks for being with us.
Oh, it's great to be with you again, Seth. Thanks for having me.
You bet, Doc. We are privileged to have you here in Phoenix, and I have to tell you, the nation is privileged to have you generally. You are the man of so many moments, unfortunately, I have to say. And after Boston, so many minds turned to the work that you and AIFD does. What were your first reactions when you first heard about the bombing in Boston?
Well, when we saw that there were two bombs that went off, and it had some of the hallmarks of Al-Qaeda, and the first thing was to pray that there were no victims and injured. And when we heard about the 3 deaths and then the over 150 that were injured, it was horrifying. And our worst fears were realized that our country was attacked, that one of these guys, or 2 of them, got through. And quickly, we realized that these 2 were Russian or Chechen immigrants that were part of the radical Islamist movement globally. And, our country will be resilient, but as Einstein said, insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. So I hope we can grow beyond what we have witnessed as far as the horror is concerned and begin to treat the problem at its core.
Dr. Jasser, that's exactly where I wanted to go with you up front. Thank you for reminding us of that Einstein quote, because you had written, I think it was in National Review, that the Tsarnaev brothers proved that the current Homeland Security whack-a-mole strategy is severely limited. The United States must address head-on, you write, the ideology of political Islam, which is the root cause of Islamic terrorism. What do you mean by whack-a-mole strategy, and what are we not doing right?
Well, the whack-a-mole strategy is that basically they're waiting until these guys have violent intent. When they're putting together the bombs, or when the FBI has done sting programs, they are basically only finding the Al-Qaeda operatives and then, putting the bombs in their hands, and then they realize they're fake ones and they get them. So if anything, this legitimizes some of the sting programs, but still those are whack-a-mole, and that these guys are well beyond radicalization and just on the edge of doing an act of violence. And there's absolutely no way to ensure that none of them are going to get through, as Boston now has shown. And if you don't treat the problem at its root, a number of these hundreds or thousands could be headed towards the path of wanting to place a bomb, and then we just won't find one of them, and we'll miss that. So ultimately, these guys aren't evolving out of thin air. They don't just materialize. They are headed down a path. And if you look at Boston, for example, you can see a milieu, a pool, if you will, that created the ideologies that I think very obviously led to it. And, it's sort of like having a culture of alcoholism, for example, and then wondering why there's acts of violence that happen from those that are pathologically alcoholic, and the community not realizing, or families not realizing, that you have to treat it at the core. And this is the same thing. The alcoholism, the drug, the opium that gets into these guys' heads happens years before, and that's the separatism, the ideology, the supremacism of the Islamic State, the sense that the West is evil, anti-Muslim, anti-Islam. There were 2 operatives killed. There were 2 operatives convicted of helping Al-Qaeda in Boston, MIT grads, Afia Siddiqui, who was found in Afghanistan 4 years ago, Tariq Mahena, convicted in April 2012, almost a year to the date of the bombing, and almost every imam and cleric in Boston was either silent or said that it was inappropriate and he was framed and all this other stuff. So that milieu, for us not to connect the two, is just, I think, beyond negligence.
We are talking to Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. He is the president and founder of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy and the author of A Battle for the Soul of Islam. Dr. Jasser, I'm going to get into in our next segment a little bit about what your organization is doing to counter this. But I think what you just said is the taproot of everything we're dealing with. President Obama, right after Boston, said there are many unanswered questions. Quote, among them, why did young men who grew up and study here as part of our communities and part of our country resort to such violence? That was the question he posed. This is the question you have been answering. It's what you're talking about right now. No real surprise to you, is it?
No, not at all. And the problem is that we don't even seem to understand what Americanism is.
Right.
Americanism isn't doing soccer and boxing and going to public school. It's an embrace of pluralism, of a constitution that's rooted in reason and the separation of church and state, and that every individual has equal access to government and every office in this land, regardless of their faith and regardless of their theology. And I think this is what Islamists hate. And these individuals became estranged, became victims in the victim mindset, and that set them down that path. And it really is, I can't tell you how painful it is to read, in the New York Times or in Salon, they're saying, well, if these guys had guns, they would have killed more people, and there aren't that many people that have been killed with terrorism, and they're looking at numbers. And what they don't realize, this same root problem, political Islam, is what's threatening our security in Iran. It's threatening our security in Egypt with the Brotherhood. It's threatening the security at not only this domestically, but abroad. And until we develop a doctrine to counter that, terrorism is simply the tip of the iceberg.
It is the tip of the iceberg. And, what bothers me, I know it bothers you too, is some of these tips are right here in America. It's not really a total accident or eyebrow raiser that people like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed study in American universities. The founder of the Muslim Brotherhood studied at an American university in Colorado. We talk about homegrown terrorism, but sometimes we export it with what is taught here, don't we?
Absolutely. I mean, the mosque that these two guys went to occasionally now, they try to dissociate themselves from him and said, well, he was kicked out once, etc. The bottom line is the major mosque in Boston was Saudi-funded and built by the Saudis. Imam Qardawi, who's one of the most influential Islamists that propagates political Islam on Al Jazeera to 60 million Muslims around the world every week, was on their board. There were imams talking about militant jihad that Charles Jacobs had exposed at peaceandtolerance.org in Boston, and nobody had been listening to him or us talk about what danger those ideas pose. And yet when many in the media on the left address it, the imam in Boston had an op-ed in the New York Times this week where he basically was evangelizing about how peaceful Islam is, and that these guys had nothing to do with it, as if, well, let's keep moving along. Islam and Muslims have nothing to do with it. And it's not my Islam, but we have to recognize that it is a version of Islam that we have to counter and not just continue in denial.
And that's what I want to talk to you about and what you're doing to do that on the other side of this break. We'll be back with more from Dr. Zuhdi Jasser.
You're listening to Arizona Politics and Culture on 960 The Patriot. Make sure and like The Patriot on Facebook. That way you can keep up with the latest giveaways and event information. 960 The Patriot and online at 960thepatriot.com.
Bill Bennett and I write in our book, The Fight of Our Lives, that if we win this war against radical Islam, it will be due in very, very large part to the efforts of the man we have with us, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. He is the author of A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim patriot's fight to save his faith. He is the president and founder of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy and a member of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Dr. Jasser, before we went to break, we were talking a little bit about the milieu young Muslims grow up in that turns them into radicals or political Islamists or terrorists. And you talked about how widespread it is. It drove me back to a memory I just had of right after 9/11 when President Bush and key members of his administration to reassure the Muslim community, went to a mosque in Washington, and he gave one of his early and first speeches at this mosque in Washington. And Steve Emerson, I remember, was scratching his head saying, that mosque, that was one of the few places in America I could actually buy the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It is much more widespread. The problem is much more widespread than we think, isn't it?
It really is, and that's why the title of my book, and that Muslims need to recognize that it's not just the end point. We have a central battle going on in that will our faith. When I raised my children, when I was raised in America, I was taught that I could be more Muslim here, more free in a country that allowed me to choose or reject its tenets and be more Muslim than in any so-called Muslim country. And it's not a coincidence that every majority Muslim country is run by autocrats, theocrats, and propagates versions of Islam that are an anathema to freedom. And right now we see with the Arab awakening there is an opportunity to push back. And I think you'll find a lot more courageous Muslims in Egypt right now than you do in America, because their feet are to the fire. They see what's happening when the Islamists that are dictating which version of Islam they're going to practice run the government, and that wakes them up. In the United States, they have a government that protects their freedoms. The Islamists are sort of evangelizing their message and deceiving America into what it really is, which is theocracy, and they simply deal in the interfaith anesthesia, as I call it, that prevents people from being able to look at ideas critically, and it doesn't allow us to engage our youth so that they actually love America. I mean, if you look, the issue with the milieu in Boston is not only that, I'm not trying to suppress free speech of imams that are critical of Homeland Security, et cetera, but there's no balance. Just like these three that were convicted with Al-Qaeda, there were no Muslim movement saying, convict Tariq Mahana, convict Afia Siddiqui. We're happy they were put away. No, all you see is 90% of them crying of victimization, and that allows our youth to have a fertile mindset in which they can be, the soil is rife to be planted with separationism and on the path to radicalization.
That's exactly right. I once wrote that the so-called grievances of the Muslim are contrasted really to nothing in American schools or in the American society. There's no other side of the scale. There's no teaching of what we do right. There's no recognition of the wisdom and virtue of the American or Western cause. So there's nothing on the other side of the teaching or the preaching that they get in political Islam. Mark Steyn says if you're trying to put the genie in the bottle, you're going to have a problem because you've broken the bottle.
Exactly, and that's the balance that we all have in our heart and soul, is that we figure out our identity comes from at least a sense of ownership, a sense of belonging. And our Muslim Liberty Project that the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, MLP, is done to counter Muslim student associations and we have them now in 12 universities around the country, small chapters. The one at ASU has about 20 students in it, and they are bonding to what it is to be an American and understand liberty and pushing back against the ideas of theocracy. And we're teaching them that, not only can they celebrate Americanism, but it can allow them not to be in conflict with their Muslim identity. But what is in conflict with Americanism is political Islam. And we talk to them about Jeffersonian democracy and about Hayek's road to serfdom and what are the ideas of Americanism and that we can bring into our interpretation of Islam that would necessarily have to push back against Wahhabism and some of the other global ideas that Muslims say that you have to believe in, and how Sharia is actually, it may be interpreted by some as God's law, but in fact, it is always man-made law, and that we prefer governments like America. And that inoculates them against radicalization.
That's what I want to spend more time with you on the other side of this break, that very point, that very project that you're doing, Dr. Jasser. We'll be back with more from Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. He is the president and founder of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. AIFdemocracy.org is his website.
You can find us online at 960thepatriot.com. Arizona Politics and Culture, that tab's right there in the middle of the page. You can listen to podcasts of the program at your leisure. You can share those segments with your friends. You can also request Seth's monologue from the first part of the hour by sending us an email, apcpatriot@gmail.com.
Last week, I spent most of my monologue beating up on the media and gave several examples of how they just get things so wrong. Dennis Prager's line about media bias isn't what they say, really. It's in what they don't say. And when they go to a major story where it begs for information and where we're supposed to get in the newspaper some kind of education, we rely on them. And they go to the wrong people most of the time. They should be going to people like our guest, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. He is not only local here in Phoenix, he's national as well, an author of a book that's very important, A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim patriot's fight to save his faith. He is the president and founder of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. Dr. Jasser, we were talking a little bit off air. You experienced this very problem most recently with the Arizona Republic, didn't you?
Yeah, I mean, I've known them for quite some time. Yeah. Written probably between 50 and 100 editorials there. And reporter calls me, and he's getting sort of a pulse of the Muslim community leadership in Phoenix, and asked me about whether we were worried about backlash. And I basically said, listen, I'm upset that most of the Muslim organizations are selfishly after America was attacked, and we find out that these were Muslims that were radicalized under our watch as American Muslims, that we haven't been strong enough in putting programs to prevent these things. I think America needs to hear that we're ready to take ownership. And he was taken aback a bit, but took the quotes and told me that I was going to be in the story. But sure enough, the story comes out early last week, and they had quotes from CARE's leadership, from 2 imams in the valley, and the title was Local Muslims Fearful of Backlash. And they had quotes like local fear of bigotry and racism. I mean, talk about chutzpah. We're concerned as Muslims now. We're giving America lectures about bigotry after 2 immigrants did an attack of horror, terrorism against American citizens. I mean, yes, we're not going to let America unravel, and you want the rest of the citizenship to make sure that doesn't happen. But we should probably be the last ones to remember that, and the media certainly fed right into that. And my quotes ended up somewhere on the on the floor of their editing room.
A former member of the Navy and a Muslim who uses the word chutzpah only in America. I love it. We're talking to Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, but Doc, you are so right. I have to tell you, I was going, as I often do in these cases, I was going to the CARE websites. CARE is the Council for American Islamic Relations. Deemed one of the mainstream, if not the biggest mainstream Muslim organization in America, the place the media does go to, the White House goes to way too often. But that is what their press releases after Boston were about. Headlines like "Hate Will Not Fight Itself," talking about American bigotry, or CARE decries inflammatory anti-Muslim rhetoric on the Boston bombings. Meanwhile, nothing, hardly ever, any a word about the pamphlets and the writings you see in some of these mosques we have been talking about that calls Christians and Jews pigs and monkeys.
It's just amazing. It's because they are the Western arm of political Islam, but they believe in a nonviolent approach to their global evangelism of political Islam. So never would they make a link between the two. Judith Miller has a great piece in the Wall Street Journal earlier this week, where she talks about how perhaps we can look at maybe this would not have happened in New York because of the NYPD's surveillance programs and public settings of understanding where not only the mosques are, as Peter King and I have talked about publicly for years, but the process of radicalization, which the NYPD has laid out, and they were attacked by CARE and the Muslim Public Affairs Council and all the other Muslim Brotherhood legacy groups for linking ideology to radicalization. And, this link is very obvious, is about a rupture and a conflict between their ideology of Islamism and Western society. And until we make that link and make it into a national strategy to counter this domestically and globally, the whack-a-mole program is going to have to continue.
Yeah, that drives me right back to what you're doing with your American Islamic Forum for Democracy and your Muslim Liberty Project. I think the first time I became aware of it, was when you were testifying at those Peter King hearings about 2 years ago now. They were brilliant. Your testimony was fabulous. I remember CARE, and even to this day, CARE, this past week, CARE took occasion again to blast Peter King and those hearings. They were amazingly enlightening and illuminating, mostly because of what you said and what you were doing with your Muslim Liberty Project, which should be a project of our government. Dr. Jasser, you have talked a lot about Islam needing reform and the difference between political Islam and the kind of Islam you practice and teach and preach. The conflict. Tell us about it. It's actually doable. It's actually possible to engage in the kind of reform you have advocated, isn't it? You're seeing it.
It really is. I mean, so many youth see me engage with their adults, their parents, their moms, and then they realize that it's possible to have your own opinions and not fall into the rut of tribal blindness and groupthink. Actually, Islam and the Muslim community can have a awakening or enlightenment. And, the difference is really easy. Are we here in the West as Muslims in order to bring in the ideas of liberty and freedom into our faith so that we can reform and modernize? Or are we here bring Islam in a supremacist way evangelically to tell the West that their faith isn't good enough and ours is better, even though it's theocratic in the East? These two different mindsets. And I think the Islamist groups, you'll notice in their verbiage, they have nothing to improve. Islam is a religion of peace. We're perfect. You guys just need to understand our mindset. Versus in my household growing up and at our Muslim Liberty Project, our youth say, you know what? We love this country. Our homelands, our motherlands where our parents came from are being destroyed by theocrats, and we want to learn what makes the West tick so that we can inculcate it into our interpretation of our own faith.
I guess I've never asked you this question, Dr. Jasser. Is that a locution you use? Do you say Islam is a religion of peace?
I don't, because it's this bromide that means nothing. Because who's Islam? Which Islam are we talking? When I'm praying by myself, yes, it's peaceful. If it's the Wahhabi version of Islam, it's certainly not a religion of peace. So, these types of oversimplified bromides are, I think, actually more problematic than helpful.
And it shows. I mean, that was a very smart way, the way you put it. It shows that there's no room for improvement, which I guess another way to put it would be no room for modernization. Does Islam have to teach, or is it a core tenet of Islam, I guess I'm asking, that it is the duty of Muslims to convert whatever land they are in this case the United States of America, to Sharia?
This is a battle. I don't believe so.
Okay.
I don't believe in the evangelical component of our faith. I think that you represent your faith with your own personal humility and deeds, and that's it. While there are many that would span the gamut from sort of the benign evangelist to those who believe that they need to spread and create Islamic states. And, some would argue that the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which is 56 countries, is basically a neo-caliphate. But a lot of those countries really have nothing in common other than being Muslim-majority countries that seek to create a lobby against the non-Muslim countries. And, there certainly when you talk to their heads, I've been to Saudi Arabia and Egypt in the past few months, and you talk to their ministers, they look upon us as inferior. They look upon their countries and their role to basically spread their ideas in a very supremacist way.
Dr. Zuhdi Jasser is who we're talking to. He is the president and founder of a very important organization, perhaps the most important organization when it comes outside of the U.S. military, when it comes to battling political Islam. It's the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, AIFdemocracy.org, and his book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam, is critical reading. Dr. Jasser, let me just switch gears with you half a moment if I can. You're a very busy man. You do a lot of things, all of them well. The news out of this, you've been on the case of Syria, the issue of Syria, for some time now. You have a Save Syria Now coalition. And the news that came out this week was that the United States now agrees with other countries' analysis that Syria, Assad, has used chemical weapons. The news stories that were the latest I read, I guess on Friday, was that what we are going to do about it is next to nothing. We're going to go to the UN, which will do next to nothing, and we're going to pursue further investigation, which will mean next to nothing because Syria is not allowing anyone in to investigate, to inspect. What does this mean to you? What does this say to you? What should we be doing?
Well, I can tell you that there's nothing that hits more close to home than what's happening in Syria. My mom's family and so many of our families some are homeless, some have no work anymore because their businesses have been destroyed. They're pushing up to over 80,000 dead, 3 million displaced. The government is basically evolving into a growing genocide there of its own people. and we've been silent. And this red line, Paul Wolfowitz said it best earlier this week on CNN. He said it's just shameful that we've had red lines over whether the dead were gassed, and somehow the way they're killed seems to matter, and it really makes us look like a paper tiger.
Wow.
And, others have said that, the fact that President Obama is dancing around this red line is actually going to embolden not only Syria, but it's going to embolden Iran.
And that's the point. That's the real
point.
point.
Nuclear weapons.
That's the real point, because Syria is a satrap. It is a client state. It is a parasite of Iran, is it not?
Exactly.
We
really
built, and we caused this. I mean, we frankly caused this. From the culture to the politics. Hillary Clinton talking about Assad as a reformer. Gosh, do you remember how many trips Warren Christopher made to Syria? John Kerry. Vogue magazine highlights the Assads as if they are just the next incarnation of Princess Grace of Monaco. It's frankly disgusting how we elevate these dictators and then do nothing about them once we have given them the credibility that they seek.
And I have to tell you, when I talk to our Muslim youth, that's probably one of the biggest hurdles I have to make, because I admit to them, a mea culpa.
Mm-hmm.
I tell them we have to push as Americans, not only as Muslims, that we push for the same ideals at home that we do abroad. Yeah. I mean, what am I going to tell them when they say they're right? When they say we've got our government is facilitating dictators in Saudi Arabia, in Syria, and elsewhere. And we don't seem to stand for things like we do in our own Constitution. And that hypocrisy is so evident in the State Department's work. And this is why I became a neoconservative in the 90s. Neoconservatism was about finally putting to bed the Soviet era, the Cold War, where we picked the lesser of two evils and said that, that era is over. We're going to start advancing democracy and freedom abroad. As President Bush said, every citizen in the world should feel the same sense of wanting to be free. And that's what his policy was about. And unfortunately, it got lost in our domestic politics.
The head of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, Dr. Jasser, Zuhdi Jasser, and the author of A Battle for the Soul of Islam. You must read this book, folks. You must go to his website, aifdemocracy.org. He will be the reason we win this war, if we win this war, and I'm sorry to use the word if. Dr. Jasser, just a different kind of question. I'm sitting here thinking about how much you do, how much you produce in all of this, and then you kind of jokingly say you have a different life, or another part of your life, which is your medical practice, which is one of the greatest medical practices in the state of Arizona. You're an esteemed doctor, and of course you have a beautiful family. How do you do it all? Seriously, how do you do it all? How do you stay so optimistic? What keeps you going?
Contrary to my contrarians in my faith community that disagree with me, it's about God. It's about believing that the greatest gift God gave the world was the United States, and that in order to leave a legacy, you have to do it in every aspect of your life, your family, your children you leave behind, your patients that you take care of, your community and your state and country. It's about service, and to me, that's what my Islam is about. And when you see these things, it rips our families apart to see this happen in Boston, and then feel that Americans feel that this is what Islam is. And, I know that I have to harness every ounce of energy I have to not only leave a mark with people that meet me in my work and family, but also nationally, and that I want my children to have somewhere to turn to, that they don't have a conflict between their faith and their country.
I wish our dictionary was bigger, but Dr. Jasser, from the top and bottom of my heart, all I can say is thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
God bless you, son.
You too, Dr. Jasser. That was Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, an American hero by any standard, by any definition.
I believe he has just articulated our closing audio from Ronald Reagan as well. Did he not?
He did.
Very clearly. So just mark my words, 1 hour from now, you're going to hear Ronald Reagan's words from the 60s. And because they're good words. That's why they stand up to the test of time. You're listening to Arizona Politics and Culture on 960 The Patriot. You can get links to podcasts of this conversation or Seth's monologue from the beginning of the hour by sending an email, apcpatriot@gmail.com.